Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, I want to take you somewhere that doesn't exist in our world and yet somehow feels closer to us than we realize. Not a place of darkness, not a place of chaos, but a place where everything was once perfect. Before fear, before doubt, before anything ever fell apart, there was only light. And I've been thinking about this lately. Not just about heaven, not just about angels, but about something much quieter, something much closer. How does something perfect begin to break? Because if a being like Lucifer, the most beautiful, the most trusted of all creation, could fall, then what does that say about us? Tonight, I don't want to just tell you a story. I want to understand it. I want to walk through those moments with you slowly, carefully, not as someone who has all the answers, but as someone who has asked the same questions. Questions like, what if the greatest battles don't begin with war, but with a single thought? What if the most dangerous words ever spoken were not shouted in rebellion, but whispered quietly inside a heart? I will ascend. Just 3 words, and yet they were enough to tear heaven apart. Tonight, we're going to explore those 3 days, 3 days that changed eternity. 3 days when light collided with darkness for the very first time. 3 days when a being made of pure beauty became something else entirely. And as we move through this story, I want you to listen closely, not just to what happened, but to how it happened. Because somewhere in that story, in those quiet moments before everything collapsed, there may be something that feels uncomfortably familiar. So before you get comfortable, take a gentle moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if these deep sleep history stories help you find peace, sleep better, or simply reflect on our shared journey through time. Now, close your eyes, let the noise of the world fade away, slowly, and come with me, back to a moment before humanity ever took its first breath, back to a place where perfection lived, and where, for the very first time, began to crack. I used to believe something very simple, almost comforting in its certainty, that perfection, once reached, could never truly fall apart, that a place without flaws would remain untouched by conflict, that if there were ever a realm untouched by doubt, untouched by fear, untouched by the quiet fractures we feel as humans, then surely nothing within it could ever break. And yet, the more I sit with this story, the more I begin to question that belief. Because what we are about to step into tonight is not a world like ours, not bound by gravity or time or the slow passing of days, but something far beyond it, something that existed before the first breath of humanity, before the first shadow was ever cast. There was only light, but not the kind of light we know, not sunlight spilling across a horizon, not the artificial glow of a distant city. This was a light that had no source outside of itself, a living presence, steady, endless, a kind of radiance that did not flicker or fade, as if existence itself was illuminated from within. And I try to imagine it sometimes, what it would feel like to stand in a place where nothing is hidden, where every surface reflects something pure, where the air itself seems to hum with a quiet awareness, not noise, not chaos, but something closer to harmony, something that doesn't demand your attention, yet gently surrounds you. And in that place, there were no walls in the way we understand them, no borders, no limits, only vast expanses of clarity, like crystal stretching endlessly in every direction. And yet it was not empty, it was alive. Not in the way we describe life on Earth, but in a way that feels almost impossible to put into words. Movement without disruption, order without force. Everything existing exactly as it was meant to be. And I wonder sometimes what it does to a being to live in a place like that, a place where nothing is lacking, where nothing needs to be fixed, where nothing competes. Because here, in our world, everything is driven by contrast, light and dark, gain and loss, success and failure. But there was no opposite, only completeness, only fullness. And maybe that's why this part of the story unsettles me the most. Because if something can break there, then maybe the problem was never the environment. Maybe it was never about imperfection at all. Maybe it was something deeper, something that can exist even in the presence of absolute beauty. And as I try to picture it more clearly, I find myself drawn to the center of it all. Not a throne made of gold or stone, but something far more abstract, something that doesn't sit in space but defines it, a presence so vast, so steady, that everything around it seems to move in quiet alignment, and surrounding that presence, countless beings, not identical, not mechanical, but each with their own purpose, their own form, their own place in the harmony, moving not out of obligation, but as if they were naturally aligned with something greater than themselves. And I pause there for a moment because that idea feels almost foreign to us, to act without resistance, to exist without questioning your place. And I can't help but ask myself, would we feel peace in that world? Or would we feel something else, something subtle, something quiet, something that eventually begins to whisper? Because here's the question that keeps returning to me. If everything was truly perfect, if nothing was missing, if nothing was broken, then why? Why would war ever begin? Why would a thought of rebellion even form? What could possibly grow in a place where nothing is lacking? And that's where this story becomes less about heaven and more about something uncomfortably familiar, because maybe perfection doesn't prevent the fall. Maybe it simply hides the conditions where it begins. And as we move forward, deeper into this world of light, I want you to hold on to that question, not to answer it yet, just to let it sit quietly in the background, because sometimes the most important questions are the ones that don't resolve immediately, the ones that stay with you as everything else slowly begins to unfold. And as I stay in that image a little longer, letting the stillness of that place settle in, I begin to notice something else, something that feels almost impossible in our world. Everything here has a place, not assigned by pressure, not forced into position, but naturally aligned, as if each being simply knows where it belongs. And for some reason, that ideal's both beautiful and slightly unsettling. Because I think about our world, how often we question where we stand, what we should be doing, whether we are enough, whether we chose the right path. And here, none of that seems to exist. There is no confusion, no comparison, no silent competition hiding beneath polite smiles, only clarity, only purpose. And I find myself wondering, what would it feel like to exist without that inner noise? To move through existence without ever doubting your role, because in this place there were beings beyond anything we can fully imagine, not just one kind, not just one form, but layers of existence, each with its own function, its own presence, its own expression of something greater, and closest to the center, closest to that overwhelming presence of light, were the seraphim, beings of fire, not destructive fire, but something purer, something that doesn't consume but reveals. They did not stand as we would understand standing. They hovered, they burned, they existed in constant motion. And yet, nothing about them felt chaotic, with wings that moved not out of effort, but as if they were part of the very rhythm of that realm. And what strikes me the most is not their power, but their focus. They are described as covering their faces, as if even they, being so close to the source of everything, could not fully look upon it. And I pause there, because that image says something deeper than description. It speaks of a kind of awareness, a kind of humility that we rarely see even in ourselves, and below them, or perhaps not below in rank, but different in purpose, were the cherubim, guardians, watchers, beings that did not drift in constant praise, but remained steady, observant, aware of everything around them. And there's something almost intense about their presence, something that feels grounded, firm, like they hold a kind of responsibility that doesn't waver. They do not question, they do not hesitate, they simply are what they were created to be. And I can't help but notice the contrast, movement and stillness, fire and watchfulness, expression and protection. And yet none of it clashes, none of it competes. It all fits together like parts of something too complete to fracture. And then there are the archangels, the ones who move between purpose and presence, leaders, messengers, protectors, not because they seek authority, but because authority was placed within them. And that distinction feels important because in our world, power is something people chase, something they fight for, something they measure themselves against. But here, power seems almost incidental, like a byproduct of alignment, not ambition. And each of them carries something distinct, something that defines their role without limiting it. And as I observe this, or at least try to imagine observing it, I keep coming back to the same quiet realization. Everything here, every being, every movement, every role exists without friction, without resistance, without the need to prove itself. And that's when the thought returns, soft, almost uninvited. What happens when something in that system stops accepting its place? Not because it is forced, but because it begins to question. Because up until now, nothing has needed to justify its existence. Nothing has needed to ask, why me, or why not me? And yet, that question feels so human, so familiar that I can't ignore it. Because even in a place like this, where everything fits perfectly, where nothing is missing, where nothing feels out of order, the possibility of doubt still lingers, not visible, not spoken, but present like a quiet space between thoughts. And I wonder if everything truly has its place, then what happens when something decides it wants more than its place? Not out of necessity, not out of survival, but simply because it can imagine something else, because that might be where the shift begins. Not in chaos, not in destruction, but in a single deviation, a single moment where alignment turns into comparison and purpose turns into desire. And as I stay with that idea, I realize something that feels almost uncomfortable to admit. Maybe the most fragile thing in a perfect system is not its structure, but the freedom within it, because the moment something is free to choose, it is also free to step away. And here, in a place where everything had its place, that possibility was already waiting. And somewhere within that perfect order, within that harmony, where nothing seemed out of place, there was one being who stood out, not as a disruption, not as an anomaly, but as the very embodiment of beauty itself. And I find myself slowing down here, because this part of the story always lingers a little longer in my mind, as if something about it refuses to be rushed. His name was Lucifer, the light bearer, the morning star. And even now, just saying that name feels different. Not dark, not yet, but luminous, almost reverent. And I try to imagine what it must have been like to witness him in that state, before anything changed, before any fracture began to form, because everything we've seen so far, the order, the purpose, the quiet alignment of every being, all of it seemed to converge in him, as if he was not just part of the system, but its most radiant expression. And I've caught myself thinking this more than once. If there was ever a being who could not fall, if there was ever a presence so complete, so fully realized that failure would be impossible, it would have to be him. And maybe that's what makes this story so unsettling, because it doesn't begin with weakness, it begins with perfection. Lucifer was not merely beautiful in the way we describe beauty, not symmetry, not appearance, but something deeper, something that seemed to radiate outward from within him. Like the light did not just touch him, it moved through him. His form, if it can even be called that, was described as adorned with every precious stone, not placed on him, but part of him. Sapphire, emerald, ruby, topaz, each one catching the light and reflecting it in endless variations, so that whenever he moved, the entire space around him seemed to shift in color, in tone, in feeling. And I wonder what it would do to the mind to exist like that, to be seen like that, to be recognized, not occasionally, but constantly. Because here, admiration wasn't hidden, it wasn't subtle, it was woven into the way others responded to him. Not out of envy, but out of genuine awe. And then there was his voice. And I think this is the part that stays with me the most, because it wasn't just sound, it wasn't just music. It was something that seemed to carry meaning beyond language, something that could express joy, sorrow, reverence, and something else, something almost unnameable. And when he sang, everything else seemed to pause, not because it had to, but because it wanted to. Even the beings closest to the throne, even those who never cease their own expressions of worship, would quiet themselves just for a moment to listen. And that detail always makes me stop and think. What kind of presence does someone have when even those who exist in constant devotion pause to hear them? And Lucifer didn't just sing, he led. He stood at the center of worship, not as the object of it, but as the one who guided it, who shaped it, who carried it forward. He was the one who turned countless voices into something unified, something elevated, something that seemed to rise higher than any single being could achieve alone. And I can't help but notice how much trust that requires to stand in that position so close to the source of everything, and yet remain aligned with it, to channel attention without ever redirecting it, to be admired without ever needing that admiration. And maybe that's where the tension begins. Not visibly, not dramatically, but quietly. Because when you exist at that level, when everything about you reflects excellence, when every movement is noticed, every sound appreciated, every presence acknowledged, I wonder how easy it is to forget that you are not the source of it as judgment. And I don't say that as judgment. I say that as someone who has felt something similar on a much smaller scale, that subtle shift when appreciation starts to feel like identity, when recognition begins to feel like ownership, when something that was given slowly begins to feel like something you earned. And I imagine Lucifer standing there, surrounded by light, surrounded by harmony, surrounded by beings who respected him, who followed his lead, who responded to his voice, and for the first time, not questioning it, but noticing it. And that moment feels so small, so insignificant, almost invisible. And yet, I can't shake the feeling that everything changes right there. Not when he rebels, not when he speaks, not when war begins, but in that quiet awareness, that realization that he is seen, that he is admired, that he is powerful. And I keep returning to that thought over and over, because if there was ever someone who shouldn't fail, someone who had every reason to remain steady, it would have been him. And maybe that's the part that unsettles me the most, because it forces a question I don't really want to answer. If someone like Lucifer could begin to shift, could begin to see himself differently, then what about us? What about the moments when we are praised, when we are recognized, when we feel like we're doing something right? Are those moments as stable as we think they are, or are they the beginning of something quieter, something that grows slowly, unnoticed, until one day it isn't quiet anymore? And as I sit with that, I realize something that feels almost impossible to ignore. Maybe the problem was never his power, never his beauty, never his voice. Maybe the problem was what happens when all of those things exist together without resistance, without challenge, without anything to remind you that they were never yours to begin with. And this is where everything becomes quiet, not the kind of quiet that feels peaceful, but the kind that feels like something is about to change, something small, something almost invisible. And I think this is the part of the story that matters more than anything else, because nothing breaks yet, nothing falls. There is no rebellion, no war, no darkness spreading across heaven, just a moment, a single thought. And I keep coming back to this idea because if you miss this moment, the rest of the story feels inevitable. But if you stay here, if you really look closely, you start to see how fragile perfection actually is. Lucifer is still standing where he has always stood, before the throne, surrounded by light, surrounded by harmony. His voice still carries through heaven, flawless, powerful, unchanged, and yet something shifts. Not in what he does, but in what he notices. He sees the light move across his wings. He sees the way it reflects, the way it bends, the way it fills the space around him. And for the first time, he doesn't just exist within that beauty, he becomes aware of it. And that awareness feels harmless, almost natural, because how could it not be? How could someone not notice what they are, what they've been given, what they represent? And I pause here because I recognize that feeling more than I want to admit. That quiet realize something about yourself, something good, something admirable, something that others might see, and for a second, it feels deserved, it feels true. And maybe it is true. Maybe that's what makes it so dangerous, because the thought itself is not a lie. I am magnificent. It isn't false. Lucifer was magnificent. He was created that way, intentionally, beautifully, perfectly. And that's what makes this moment so subtle, because nothing about it feels wrong at first. Nothing about it triggers alarm. There is no sudden darkness, no immediate corruption, just recognition, just a quiet shift from awareness to ownership, from receiving to claiming. And I think about how easy it is to stay there, how easy it is to repeat that thought, to turn it over, to let it settle deeper. Because once you see something in yourself, it becomes harder to unsee. And I imagine Lucifer standing there, still singing, still leading, still fulfilling everything he was created to do. But now there's something else underneath it. Something quieter, something that doesn't interrupt the surface, but begins to reshape it from within. And I can almost hear it, not spoken aloud, not declared, just felt. I am magnificent. And then, almost imperceptibly, it changes. Not in words, but in weight. I am magnificent more than the others. And that's the moment that stays with me, because I've been there, not in a place like heaven, not surrounded by light, but in small, ordinary moments, when something goes right, when someone notices, when recognition lingers just a little longer than expected. And I've felt that same quiet shift, that same subtle movement from gratitude to comparison, from appreciation to elevation. And the most unsettling part is this. I didn't notice it when it happened. I didn't stop it because it didn't feel dangerous. It felt deserved. And I think that's what makes this the most important moment in the entire story. Not the fall, not the war, not the judgment, but this quiet, almost invisible fracture, because once the thought changes, once it moves from what is given to what is claimed, everything else begins to follow slowly, naturally, almost inevitably. And Lucifer doesn't step away from the throne yet. He doesn't turn his back, he doesn't speak rebellion. He simply keeps thinking, keeps observing, keeps returning to that reflection, that image of himself. And now, when he looks, he doesn't just see beauty, he sees distinction, he sees separation, he sees something that sets him apart. And I wonder, how many times does a thought like that need to repeat before it becomes belief, before it becomes identity, before it becomes something that no longer feels like a thought at all, but like truth? And as I sit with that, I realize something that feels almost uncomfortable to accept. Maybe the most dangerous thoughts are not the ones that are obviously wrong. Maybe they are the ones that feel right, the ones that are partially true, the ones that don't challenge us, but quietly elevate us. And by the time we notice what they've become, they're no longer small. They're no longer quiet. They've already begun to reshape everything. And that's where this chapter ends for me. Not with a fall, not with a break, but with a question that refuses to go away. If a single thought in a place of absolute perfection can begin something like this, then what about the thoughts we carry every day? The ones we don't question, the ones we repeat without noticing, the ones that feel harmless until they aren't. And if you stay with that moment, if you don't rush past it, you begin to notice something even more unsettling. Nothing changes all at once. There is no sudden break, no dramatic shift, no visible fall. Everything continues exactly as it was. The light still fills every corner of heaven. The harmony remains untouched. The voices rise and fall in perfect unity, and Lucifer, he is still there, still standing before the throne. still singing with the same clarity, the same power, the same beauty, and yet something has already begun to move, something so small, so gradual, that no one else would ever notice it. Not Michael, not Gabriel, not even those closest to him, because the change isn't in what he does, it's in where his attention begins to rest. And that's what makes this part so difficult to see, because from the outside, nothing is wrong. Everything appears intact, everything sounds the same, everything looks the same, but inside, the direction has shifted, not away from light, not yet, but slightly inward, slightly closer to himself. And I find myself pausing here again, because this kind of change feels familiar in a way I can't ignore. It doesn't happen all at once. It doesn't announce itself. It unfolds slowly, almost patiently, as if it's waiting for you not to notice. And Lucifer begins to observe himself, not once, not twice, but repeatedly, in small moments, quiet moments, moments where no one is watching, where there is no expectation, no role to perform, and he notices things he had never focused on before, the way his voice carries through space, the way others respond to it, the way their attention shifts when he begins to sing. And none of that is new. None of it has changed. What has changed is that he is now aware of it. And awareness has a strange effect. Once it begins, it doesn't easily stop. It deepens, it sharpens, it returns again and again. And each time it does, it leaves something behind, a trace, a subtle reinforcement. And I imagine Lucifer standing there, continuing his role, continuing his purpose. But now, with a part of his mind turned inward, quietly observing, quietly measuring, quietly noticing. And at first, it doesn't interrupt anything. The worship remains pure, the harmony remains intact. But something beneath it is beginning to separate, like two layers slowly drifting apart, the act and the awareness of the act. And I wonder how long that can continue, how long something can exist in two places at once, aligned, and yet slowly shifting. And the most dangerous part is this: there is no resistance, no internal alarm, no sense that anything is wrong, because nothing about this feels like rebellion. Nothing about this feels like disobedience. It feels like recognition, like clarity, like finally seeing something that was always there. And I think that's what makes this moment so deceptive, because it doesn't feel like a step away from purpose. It feels like a deeper understanding of it, and yet it isn't. It's the beginning of something else entirely, something that doesn't oppose the system yet, but begins to redefine it internally. And Lucifer doesn't stop. He doesn't pull back. He doesn't question the direction of these thoughts, because why would he? They don't feel dangerous. They feel deserved. They feel accurate. They feel like truth. And so they continue. Slowly, quietly, building layer upon layer until the focus begins to change. Not completely, not suddenly, but enough to shift the center of attention, enough to introduce something new, something that was never there before. And I realize as I sit with this, that this is how most things begin. Not with defiance, not with open rejection, but with a gradual redirection of attention, so subtle, so slow, that by the time it becomes visible, it has already taken root. And maybe that's why this part of the story feels so important to me, because it doesn't feel distant. It doesn't feel like something that only happens in heaven. It feels close, uncomfortably close, like something that can happen anywhere at any time without warning. And as I watch this unfold, or at least try to imagine watching it unfold, I keep returning to the same quiet realization. It wasn't immediate, it wasn't explosive, it was slow, almost invisible, and that's exactly what made it dangerous. And somewhere along that slow, almost invisible shift, something changes again, not dramatically, not in a way that anyone else would notice, but in a way that begins to reshape how Lucifer sees everything around him. Because awareness, once it turns inward, doesn't stay still, it keeps moving, it keeps searching, and eventually it begins to compare. And I think this is the moment where everything starts to feel strangely familiar. Not distant, not divine, but human. Because comparison, that quiet measuring of self against others, is something we know far too well. And Lucifer, without realizing it at first, begins to do the same. He looks at Michael, strong, unwavering, the protector, the one who stands closest to the defense of the throne, and there is respect there, still. But now, there is also observation, a subtle weighing, a quiet calculation, not spoken, not even fully formed, just a sense of difference. And then he looks at Gabriel, the messenger, the one who carries the voice of the Most High, whose words shape events beyond heaven itself. And again, there is admiration, but it is no longer simple. It is layered now, touched by something else, something that asks, not loudly, but persistently, where do I stand in all this? And that question, once it appears, doesn't fade, it deepens, it expands, it starts to connect things that were never meant to be connected. Because in a place where everything has its role, comparison was never necessary. It served no purpose. But now it begins to create something new, something subtle, something dangerous, a hierarchy not assigned by purpose, but constructed by perception. And Lucifer begins to see himself differently, not just as part of the whole, but as something distinct, something elevated, something that stands apart. And I can almost feel the shift in that moment, because it's not about rejecting others, not yet. It's about redefining himself. And that distinction feels small, but it changes everything. Because once you begin to see yourself as separate as more, as different in a way that implies value, it becomes harder to return to simply being part of something greater. And I find myself thinking, this is where it starts to feel uncomfortably close to us, because this is not rebellion, this is not defiance, this is something quieter, something we experience every day. That moment when we look at someone else, and instead of simply seeing them, we measure ourselves against them. We ask where we stand, whether we are ahead, behind, better, worse. And even when the answer isn't spoken, the act of asking begins to shape us. And Lucifer continues to observe, continues to compare, continues to notice the way his voice moves through heaven, the way others respond to it, the way his presence draws attention. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, admiration turns into confirmation. Confirmation turns into belief. And belief begins to solidify into identity. And now, when he looks at Michael, he doesn't just see strength, he sees something he might surpass. When he looks at Gabriel, he doesn't just see purpose, he sees something he might rival. And that's when the shift becomes irreversible. Not outwardly, not yet, but internally, because the system that once felt complete now begins to uneven. Not because it changed, but because his perception of it did. And I pause here again, because this is the part that unsettles me the most. Not the grandeur, not the scale, but the familiarity. Because this is exactly how it happens with us. Not in dramatic decisions, not in obvious turning points, but in quiet comparisons, repeated over time, until they begin to redefine how we see ourselves. And once that happens, everything else begins to follow. Slowly, naturally, almost without resistance. And I can't help but think this is the moment where the story stops feeling distant and starts feeling like a reflection. Because the question is no longer about Lucifer, it becomes something else, something closer, something harder to ignore. When does awareness turn into comparison? And when does comparison turn into something that begins to pull us away from where we belong? And as that thought lingers, I realize something that feels both simple and deeply unsettling. This is the moment where everything begins to feel human, even in a place that was never meant to be. And maybe that's exactly why it matters. And then, almost quietly, almost without warning, the question finally takes shape, not as a declaration, not as rebellion, but as something softer, something that feels almost reasonable. Why do I serve? And I pause there, because out of everything in this story, this might be the moment that changes everything. Not the war, not the fall, not even the choice itself, but the question that makes the choice possible. Because before this, there was awareness, there was comparison, there was a growing sense of identity. But now it begins to form into something sharper, something that challenges the very structure of everything that exists around him. And what unsettles me the most is how simple it sounds, how familiar it feels. Because on the surface, it doesn't sound wrong, it doesn't sound evil, it doesn't sound destructive. It sounds like curiosity, like reflection, like a desire to understand one's place. And maybe that's why it's so dangerous, because the most dangerous questions are rarely the ones that sound obviously wrong. They're the ones that feel justified, the ones that seem reasonable, the ones that don't immediately trigger resistance. And Lucifer stands there, still within the light, still within the harmony. But now, that question begins to echo, not once, but repeatedly. Why do I serve? And each time it returns, it carries a little more weight, a little more presence, a little more influence over how he sees everything else. Because once the question is asked, everything begins to reorganize around it. His role, his position, his identity, all of it begins to shift under the pressure of that single thought. And I can almost feel how it would unfold slowly, quietly, like something being rearranged beneath the surface. Because now, when he looks at the throne, he no longer sees only purpose, he sees hierarchy. When he looks at himself, he no longer sees only design, he sees potential. And when those two perceptions meet, the gap between them begins to feel like something that needs to be resolved. And I find myself thinking, this is where it stops being passive. This is where the thought begins to move toward intention. Why do I serve is not just a question, it's a challenge, not spoken outwardly, but forming inwardly, challenging the structure that once felt unquestionable. And I can't help but sit with that, because I've asked questions like that before, not in a place like heaven, but in small, ordinary moments. Moments where something didn't feel fair, where something didn't feel equal, where I looked at my position, my role, my effort, and quietly asked, why me? Why this? Why not more? And in those moments, it never felt dangerous. It felt honest. It felt like clarity, like finally seeing something that had always been there. And maybe that's the part that matters most, because Lucifer doesn't see this question as rebellion. He sees it as realization, as awakening, as truth. And once that belief takes hold, everything else begins to align with it, because now the system itself begins to feel flawed. Not because it is flawed, but because it no longer reflects how he sees himself. And I realize something here that feels almost impossible to ignore. The moment we believe we deserve more, not based on purpose, but based on perception, everything around us begins to feel insufficient, and that feeling, that quiet dissatisfaction begins to grow, not loudly, not violently, but steadily. And Lucifer continues to turn the question over in his mind, examining it, justifying it, reinforcing it, until it begins to sound less like a question and more like a conclusion. I should not serve. And that shift from question to belief is where everything changes. Because now it is no longer something to consider. It is something to act upon. And I think this is why this moment feels so heavy to me, because it's not dramatic, it's not explosive, it's quiet, internal, almost invisible, and yet it carries more weight than any battle that comes after, because once that belief is formed, once it feels true, everything that follows becomes inevitable. And I sit with that thought for a moment, letting it settle, because I can't shake the feeling that this question, simple as it is, might be one of the most dangerous questions that has ever existed. Not because it is wrong, but because of what it leads to. Because once you begin to question your place without grounding yourself in purpose, you begin to create a version of reality centered entirely around yourself. And from there, the distance between truth and perception begins to grow slowly, quietly, until one day it is too wide to cross back over. And as I stay here at this moment, before anything is spoken, before anything is acted upon, I realize something that feels both simple and deeply unsettling. The fall didn't begin with defiance. It began with a question, and maybe, just maybe, that's why it's so hard to see coming. And this is the moment that feels the quietest and yet the most final, because nothing visible happens, no declaration, no rebellion spoken aloud, no sudden turning away from the light. Lucifer does not fall to his knees in defiance. He does not raise his voice against the throne. He simply continues, and that somehow is what changes everything. Because the question we just sat with, why do I serve? It doesn't disappear. It doesn't fade. It doesn't resolve itself. Instead, it stays, it lingers, it returns again and again and again. And each time it returns, it feels a little more certain, a little more justified, a little less like a question, and a little more like truth. And I think this is the part that's hardest to recognize, because there is still time here, still space to step back, still a moment where everything could have turned in a different direction. He could have stopped. He could have looked at the thought and let it go. He could have recognized the shift and chosen something else. But he doesn't, and not because he can't, but because he doesn't want to. And that distinction feels heavier than anything that comes after. Because this is not a fall forced upon him. This is not something external. This is a choice, quiet, internal, unspoken, but real. He chooses not to resist the thought. He chooses not to question it. He chooses not to let it pass. Instead, he holds on to it, examines it, returns to it, feeds it, and the more attention it receives, the more it grows. Not quickly, not dramatically, but steadily, like something taking root beneath the surface. And I find myself sitting with that idea, because I've done the same thing, not with something this vast, not with something that could reshape eternity, but with smaller thoughts, quieter thoughts. Thoughts that didn't feel dangerous at the time. Thoughts I let stay longer than I should have. Thoughts I didn't challenge, didn't interrupt, didn't stop, and over time, they became something more, something heavier, something that began to influence how I saw everything else. And Lucifer, he is doing the same thing. He continues his role, continues to stand before the throne, continues to lead, continues to appear unchanged. But internally, something is organizing itself. Something is beginning to take shape, because once the belief settles, once it feels real, the next step is inevitable. Not at action yet, but direction, a movement of intention. And he begins to think differently. Not just about himself, but about everything around him. The structure, the hierarchy, the roles. They no longer feel fixed. They feel adjustable. And that's when something new enters the picture. Not just belief, but possibility. The possibility that things could be different, that the system could change, that his position could change. And that thought begins to open a door that had always been closed. Not because it was locked, but because it was never meant to be opened. And once it is opened, it doesn't close easily, because now he is no longer just observing himself. He is imagining something else, something beyond what is given, something that places him at the center. And slowly, almost carefully, that imagination begins to form into something more structured, more intentional, more deliberate. Not a plan yet. Not fully defined, but the beginning of one, the outline of something that will eventually take shape. And what strikes me here, what really stays with me, is how quiet this moment is, how easy it would be to miss it. Because if you were watching from the outside, you would see nothing different, no change in behavior, no disruption in harmony. Everything would appear exactly the same. And yet, internally, everything has already changed. And I realize something as I sit with that, something that feels almost uncomfortable in its simplicity. The fall didn't begin when he acted. It didn't begin when he spoke. It didn't begin when he turned away. It began when he chose not to stop, when he allowed the thought to remain, when he gave it space, when he returned to it instead of releasing it. And maybe that's why this moment feels so important. because it reveals something that is easy to overlook. That destruction doesn't always come from what we do. Sometimes it comes from what we don't interrupt, what we don't question, what we allow to continue. And Lucifer stands there, still in the light, still in the presence of everything that is good, but no longer aligned with it. Not outwardly, not yet, but inwardly, completely. And from this point forward, and everything that follows, the whispers, the gathering, the war, the fall, all of it begins here, in this quiet decision, in this moment where nothing changes on the surface and everything changes underneath. And I can't help but stay with that thought a little longer, because it doesn't feel distant, it doesn't feel abstract, it feels close, like something that happens in small ways, every day, unnoticed, until one day, it isn't small anymore, and by then, it's already too late to call it just a thought. And this is where something appears that had never existed before. Not darkness, not yet, not rebellion in its full form, but something quieter, something far more subtle, something that doesn't belong in a place like this: secrecy. And I find myself slowing down again here, because if everything we've seen so far has been open, clear, transparent, then this moment feels like the first distortion. The first place where something is hidden, not from the throne, not from the light, but from each other. And that alone changes everything. Because heaven, as we've come to understand it, was never meant to contain shadows. Not physical shadows, but the kind that form in thought, in intention, in words left unspoken. And yet now, those shadows begin to form, quietly, almost imperceptibly. And Lucifer moves through that world exactly as he always has. Nothing about him appears different. His wings still reflect the same brilliance. His voice still carries the same weight. His presence still commands attention. But there is something beneath it now, something that no one can quite name. And I imagine being there, watching him, listening to him, and sensing that something has shifted, not enough to define, but enough to feel like a note slightly off in a melody that was once perfect. And after the worship ends, after the voices settle, after the space begins to empty, that's when it happens. Not in the center, not in the open, but in the quiet edges, the moments where attention fades, where presence softens, where no one expects anything to change. Lucifer begins to speak, not to all, not to the many, but to a few. Carefully, intentionally. And I think that detail matters more than it seems, because he doesn't announce anything. He doesn't reveal what he's thinking openly. He chooses proximity, chooses trust, chooses those who would listen without resistance. And I pause there, because this doesn't feel like chaos. It feels like precision, like something deliberate, something unfolding exactly as it intends to. And his words, they are not loud. They are not forceful. They don't demand attention. They invite it. They draw it in slowly, gently, almost like a question rather than a statement. And that's what makes them so difficult to resist, because they don't feel like instruction. They feel like discovery, like something the listener is arriving at on their own. And I imagine those moments, those quiet exchanges where an angel stands with him, listening, not expecting anything unusual, and then hearing something slightly different, something that doesn't disrupt the surface, but unsettles something underneath. And I think about how powerful that is, not to tell someone what to believe, but to make them feel like they've come to the idea themselves. And Lucifer understands that. He doesn't push, he suggests, he doesn't command, he asks, and slowly, those questions begin to echo beyond the moment they were spoken. Because once an idea is introduced, it doesn't stay contained, it moves, it lingers, it grows. And for the first time, there are thoughts in heaven that are not shared openly, thoughts that are held back, turned over internally, examined in silence. And I keep returning to that realization, because this is not just the spread of an idea. It's the birth of something entirely new. A space between beings where truth is no longer fully visible, where intention is no longer fully aligned, where something exists beneath the surface, and that changes the nature of everything. Because once something is hidden, it creates distance, not physical distance, but something deeper, something that separates without being seen. And I wonder what it must have felt like to be one of those angels, to hear something that doesn't quite match the harmony, to carry it afterward, to think about it in silence, not speaking it, not sharing it, just holding it. And that's when I realize this is no longer about a single thought within Lucifer. It has moved beyond him. It has begun to spread, not through force, not through declaration, but through quiet transmission, through moments that seem insignificant, conversations that seem harmless, and yet they carry something that doesn't belong. And I can't help but feel the weight of that. Because once something like this begins, it doesn't need to be loud to be powerful. It just needs to be repeated, passed from one mind to another, allowed to settle, allowed to grow. And suddenly, heaven, a place that once held nothing but clarity, now contains something else, something unspoken, something unseen, something that doesn't reveal itself immediately. And I find myself thinking, this is the moment where everything changes, not because of what is said, but because of what is no longer shared, because the moment truth is no longer fully visible. The moment thoughts begin to exist in isolation. The moment something is kept back instead of brought into the light. The system begins to fracture, slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. And maybe that's why this part of the story feels so important to me, because it doesn't look like the beginning of a war. It looks like the beginning of distance. And sometimes distance is all it takes. And this is the part that unsettles me more than anything else. Not because it is loud, not because it is obvious, but because it is so precise, so measured, so carefully shaped that it almost feels like truth. And I find myself sitting with that realization for a moment. Because Lucifer does not walk through heaven declaring rebellion. He does not gather angels and say, "Follow me against the throne." He does something far more effective. He changes the language, he changes the frame, he changes the meaning of things that were once unquestioned. And that shift is where the real danger begins, because he doesn't speak of disobedience, he speaks of freedom, he doesn't speak of overthrowing order, he speaks of fairness. And I pause here, because those words, they don't feel wrong. They don't trigger resistance. They don't sound like the beginning of something destructive. They sound like something we would agree with, something we would defend, something we would even admire. And that's exactly what makes them so powerful, because when something sounds right, we don't question it. We don't slow down and examine it. We carry it forward. And Lucifer understands that he doesn't need to lie completely. He only needs to shift the meaning of what is already true, and that realization stays with me because it feels disturbingly familiar. Not just in this story, but in the way ideas move through our own world, how easily something can be reframed, how quickly something can be made to feel different without actually changing its surface. And I imagine those conversations again, those quiet moments where an angel stands with him, listening and hearing words that resonate, words that feel aligned with something deep inside them. You were created with power, with awareness, with purpose. Should that not come with freedom? And I can feel how that would land, how it wouldn't feel like manipulation. It would feel like recognition, like someone finally putting words to something you didn't even know you were thinking. And that's what makes it so effective, because it doesn't feel imposed, it feels discovered, and then he moves further. Not quickly, not forcefully, but carefully. Is it truly just to exist in a system where one is always above and others are always below? And again, the question feels reasonable. It feels logical. It feels almost necessary. And I sit with that question myself, because in isolation, it doesn't feel dangerous. It feels like something worth exploring. And that's when it becomes clear to me. The danger is not in the words themselves. It's in where they lead. Because once those ideas take root, once they begin to settle, They start to reshape perception. They begin to reframe everything that was once accepted without question. And slowly, the structure of heaven, which was once seen as harmony, begins to feel like hierarchy, begins to feel like limitation, begins to feel like something that needs to be corrected. And I realize something here that feels almost impossible to ignore. Lucifer is not creating new desires. He is redirecting existing ones. He is taking what already exists, awareness, identity, purpose, and turning it slightly, just enough to change its direction. And I think this is why it feels so difficult to resist, because nothing about it feels false. It feels incomplete, partially true, and that partial truth is what gives it strength, because a complete lie can be rejected, it can be recognized, it can be dismissed, but something that contains truth, something that aligns just enough with reality, becomes much harder to see clearly. And I find myself returning to that thought again and again, because it's not the deception that frightens me. It's the accuracy within it, the way it mirrors something real, the way it reflects something that already exists and twists it just enough to create something new, something unstable. And I imagine the angels hearing these words, not all at once, not in a single moment, but over time, in fragments, in conversations, in reflections that begin to echo internally. And each time they hear it, it feels more reasonable, more justified, more aligned with their growing sense of self, until eventually it no longer feels like something they were told. It feels like something they believe. And that's when the shift becomes irreversible, because once an idea feels like your own, it becomes part of how you see everything else. And I sit with that realization for a moment longer, because it changes the way I look at this entire story. This isn't just about influence. It's about transformation, not of actions, but of perception. And once perception changes, everything else follows. And maybe that's why this part stays with me the most, because it doesn't feel distant. It doesn't feel like something confined to heaven. It feels present. It feels real. It feels like something that happens quietly, slowly, without announcement, until one day, the meaning of everything has shifted. And I realize something that I can't quite ignore. What scares me most about Lucifer in this moment is not that he lies, but that he doesn't have to, because the truth, when reshaped just slightly, can become something far more powerful than any lie ever could. And this is the moment where the story becomes harder to judge and much easier to understand, because up until now, it would be simple to imagine a clear line, a clear division between what is right and what is wrong, between loyalty and rebellion, between truth and deception. But that line begins to blur here. Not because the truth changes, but because the hearts receiving it begin to shift. And I find myself thinking about them. The ones who listened, the ones who didn't immediately turn away, not because they were evil, not because they hated the light, but because something in them responded, something in them paused. And instead of rejecting the idea, they allowed it to stay. And I sit with that for a moment, because this part feels uncomfortably close, because I've been there in moments where something didn't feel completely right, but not wrong enough to dismiss, something that lingered just long enough to be considered, just long enough to be carried forward. And Lucifer continues moving quietly through heaven, speaking not to all, but to those who are most receptive, those who already carry a subtle restlessness, a quiet sense that something could be different. And among them, there is one figure that stands out: Beelzebub. Strong, capable, intelligent, not reckless, not impulsive, but thoughtful. And that detail matters more than it seems, because doubt does not always take root in weakness. Sometimes it takes root in awareness, in the ability to think, to question, to reflect. And I imagine that moment when Lucifer approaches him, not as a leader commanding a follower, but as one voice speaking to another, calmly, carefully, almost gently. And the conversation doesn't begin with rebellion, it begins with recognition. You have strength, you have understanding. Do you not see what you are? And I can feel how that would land, not as manipulation, but as validation, as someone finally acknowledging something that has always been there. And Beelzebub listens, not with resistance, but with curiosity. Because nothing he hears feels wrong, it feels incomplete, like something that deserves to be explored. And slowly, the questions begin to take shape, not imposed, but forming naturally. Is this all there is? Is this where I belong? And I find myself pausing again, because this is where everything becomes complicated, because these are not questions born from hatred. They are not driven by destruction. They are driven by thought, by awareness, by the simple act of asking what else might exist. And I realize something here that feels important. Doubt does not require malice. It only requires space, space to exist, space to grow, space to remain unanswered. And once that space is created, it begins to expand. And Beelzebub is not alone. Others begin to listen as well. Not all, not even most, but enough. Enough for something to begin forming beneath the surface. A quiet shift, a subtle movement away from certainty, and I imagine them standing in their roles, still fulfilling their purpose, still moving within the harmony, but now carrying something else, something unspoken, something unresolved. And that presence begins to change how they see everything around them. The throne, no longer just a center of order, but something to question. Their role, no longer just purpose, but something to evaluate. And I sit with that realization for a moment longer, because this is where the story becomes less about good and evil and more about something else entirely, something far more human. The moment when thought begins to outweigh trust, when awareness begins to challenge alignment, when the act of thinking begins to pull us away from where we once stood without hesitation. And I don't see villains here. Not yet. I see individuals, each standing at the edge of something they don't fully understand, each carrying a question they didn't have before. And that's what makes this part so unsettling, because it's easy to judge rebellion after it happens. It's easy to point to the outcome and define it as wrong. But here, in this moment, nothing has happened yet. No lines have been crossed. No sides have been chosen. There is only uncertainty. Only hesitation. Only the quiet beginning of something that has not yet revealed what it will become. And I keep returning to that thought because it changes how I see them. They are not falling, they are thinking. And sometimes that is where everything begins, not because thinking is wrong, but because without something to anchor it, it can lead anywhere. And as I sit here watching this unfold, I realize something that feels both simple and difficult to accept. Not everyone who listens becomes lost, but everyone who becomes lost once listened. And maybe that's why this moment matters so much, because it's not about who they are, it's about what they allow to stay. And once it stays, once it settles, once it begins to shape how they see the world around them, the direction is no longer neutral. It has already begun to move. Quietly, slowly, almost imperceptibly, but undeniably forward. And this is the moment where something that was once invisible begins to take shape. Not loudly, not all at once, but gradually, like a shift in the air that you can't quite see, but you can feel, because the whispers, the questions, the quiet conversations that once existed in isolated moments are no longer isolated. They begin to connect, they begin to align, they begin to form something larger than a single thought. And I find myself watching this unfold with a growing sense of unease, because what was once internal, what once belonged to individual minds, is now becoming shared. And that changes everything, because an idea held by one can be questioned, but an idea held by many begins to feel real, begins to feel validated, begins to feel inevitable. And slowly, almost without anyone noticing the exact moment it happens, groups begin to form. Not declared, not officially chosen, but naturally. Those who resonate with these thoughts begin to gather, to speak more often, to linger a little longer in those quiet spaces after everything else has ended. And there is still no rebellion, not yet. No open defiance, no lines drawn in the light, but something has shifted, something that cannot easily be undone. Because now, the questions are no longer personal. They are collective, they are echoed, reinforced, expanded. And I imagine those moments where an angel hears something, feels something, and then finds another who feels the same. And in that shared recognition, something solidifies, something moves from doubt to belief. And I pause here because this is where it becomes irreversible, not in action, but in alignment. Because once individuals begin to align around a shared perception, they are no longer simply thinking, they are moving, even if that movement is still quiet, still hidden, still waiting to be revealed. And I find myself thinking about how subtle this transition is, how easy it would be to miss, because from the outside, heaven still looks the same, the light has not dimmed, the order has not collapsed, the harmony still exists. And yet beneath that surface, something entirely different is taking form, something that doesn't belong to the original design, and it spreads not through force, not through command, but through agreement, through resonance, through the quiet realization that others see what you see. And that realization is powerful because it removes doubt, it replaces uncertainty with confidence. And once that confidence takes hold, the hesitation begins to fade. And I think this is the moment where everything begins to accelerate, not visibly, not yet, but internally, because what once felt like a possibility now begins to feel like a direction. And I can't help but feel the weight of that shift. Because this is no longer about a single being questioning his place. This is about a growing number of beings beginning to question the structure itself. And I wonder what it must have felt like for those who remained unchanged, those who did not listen, those who did not allow those thoughts to take root. Because now they would begin to notice something different, something subtle, something that doesn't fit the harmony they have always known. And that's where Michael comes into focus. Not because he is louder, not because he is more powerful, but because he is attentive. Because he is grounded in something that does not shift with perception. And I imagine him standing there, watching, not reacting immediately, not assuming the worst, but sensing that something is no longer aligned, that something within the system has begun to move in a direction it was never meant to go. And that awareness feels different from everything we've seen so far. It is not reactive. It is not emotional. It is steady, observant, patient. And yet, even he does not act immediately, because what he sees is not clear enough to confront, not defined enough to challenge. It exists in that space between certainty and doubt. And I find myself sitting with that tension, because this is where the story holds its breath. This is where everything is still technically intact, still functioning, still whole on the surface, and yet something has already gone too far. Something has already crossed a line that cannot be easily traced. And I think this is why this moment feels so heavy, because there is still time, still a chance, still a possibility that everything could return to what it was. But that possibility is fading, not because it has been removed, but because it is no longer desired by those who have already begun to move away. And I realize something here that I can't quite ignore. The point of no return doesn't arrive with a dramatic event. It arrives quietly, in the moment where enough minds have shifted, enough perspectives have changed, enough individuals have aligned around something that was never meant to exist. And by the time it becomes visible, by the time it becomes undeniable, it is already too late to stop it without consequence. And that thought stays with me longer than I expect, because it doesn't feel distant. It doesn't feel like something that only happens in a place like heaven. It feels close, familiar, like something that happens in small groups, in quiet spaces, in conversations that seem harmless until they aren't. And as I sit with that realization, I can't help but return to a single quiet thought, one that feels heavier each time it comes back. And by then, maybe, just maybe, It was already too late. And then comes the moment when whispers can no longer remain whispers, when hidden thoughts finally step into the light, when everything that had been growing quietly beneath the surface becomes visible, and heaven, for the first time, is forced to look at what has been forming inside itself. I imagine that moment with a kind of heaviness, not as a sudden explosion, but as a slow unveiling, angels gathering. Not where they had always gathered, not around the throne in perfect worship, but somewhere apart, somewhere distant enough to feel intentional. And Lucifer stands before them, no longer merely the light bearer, no longer merely the voice that led heaven in song, but something else now, something sharper, more certain, more dangerous. His beauty is still there, his voice is still powerful, but the purpose behind it has changed. And that is what makes the scene so haunting, because he still sounds inspiring, he still looks magnificent, he still carries the presence that once drew others toward worship. But now, he uses that gift to draw them toward himself. And I wonder, as I picture those angels standing before him, did they understand what they were about to lose? Did they know that choosing a new direction meant leaving behind the very light that made them who they were? Or did it still feel noble to them, still feel brave, still feel like freedom? Lucifer speaks not like a broken creature, but like someone completely convinced he has found the truth. And that conviction, perhaps more than anything, is what moves them. He tells them they were made for more, that service has been mistaken for love, that obedience has been dressed as peace, that they have bowed long enough. And I can almost feel the air change as he speaks, because words like that do something to the heart. They awaken something. They give shape to dissatisfaction. They make hesitation feel like courage. And then the words come, the words that cross the line forever. I will ascend. And I sit with those words for a moment, because they are not just ambition. They are not just desire, they are a reversal of everything he once was. He no longer wants to reflect light, he wants to become its source. He no longer wants to lead worship, he wants to receive it. He no longer wants a place within the order, he wants the order to bend around him. And as those words echo through heaven, something irreversible happens. One by one, angels step forward. Not all, but many. More than anyone wanted to believe, more than Michael feared, more than heaven itself seemed prepared to witness, a third of the host, beings once radiant, once aligned, once whole, now choosing to stand with the one who promised them more. And I try to imagine that silence, the faithful, watching their companions cross the divide, not strangers, not enemies from some distant realm, but brothers. Voices they had sung beside, hands they had served beside, presences they had known since the beginning. And I wonder if that is the true pain of this moment. Not the rebellion itself, but the recognition that those who leave were once so close. And on the other side, Michael stands, not triumphant, not eager, but grieved, because he sees what is happening, and he knows the line has finally been drawn. Not in stone, not on the ground, but in the heart. And once a heart chooses itself above the source of life, the distance becomes something no one else can close. I keep returning to the faces of those who stepped forward, because I don't think they all understood the full weight of what they were doing. Some may have believed they were choosing justice. Some may have believed they were choosing freedom. Some may have simply trusted Lucifer too much to imagine he could lead them into ruin. And that is what makes the moment so tragic. Not everyone who stands on the wrong side begins as a monster. Sometimes they begin as listeners, as questioners, as beings who allowed one idea to stay too long. And now, the quiet idea has become a public allegiance. The thought has become a movement. The movement has become a line. And on one side stands worship, order, love, purpose. And on the other side stands ambition, grievance, pride, and the promise of a throne that can never truly belong to them. And I ask myself quietly, did they know Did they feel even for a second that the light behind them was still calling, that what they were leaving was not control, but home? And maybe some of them did. Maybe some trembled as they stepped forward. Maybe some looked back just once, but still moved ahead, because once a crowd begins to move, courage and fear can look almost the same. And then heaven holds its breath, because there is no pretending anymore. No hidden conversations, no subtle questions, no secret doubts. Everything is visible now. Everything has a side, and the peace that once seemed unbreakable has become the edge of war. And as I sit with this moment, I realize the first battle was not fought with swords, it was fought in the choice to stand apart. And by the time Lucifer said, "I will ascend," the war had already begun. And then, almost imperceptibly at first, the stillness breaks, not with a roar, not with a command shouted across heaven, but with a moment of hesitation. A moment where no one quite knows what happens next. Because until now, nothing like this has ever existed. There has never been conflict here, never been resistance, never been the need to oppose another being made from the same light. And I find myself lingering in that moment. Because this is where everything feels uncertain, not yet violent, not yet destructive, just unfamiliar. And I can almost sense the confusion spreading through both sides. Because what do you do when the one standing across from you is not an enemy, but someone you once stood beside, someone whose voice once blended with yours in perfect harmony? And yet, the distance between them now feels impossible to cross. And then it happens. Not all at once, not coordinated, not even fully intentional, but something moves. A gesture, a shift, a sudden forward motion, and the first clash echoes through heaven. Not a scream, not a cry, but the sharp sound of impact, something that had never been heard before in a place like this. And that sound alone feels like the breaking of something deeper than space, something deeper than order, because it signals the beginning of something no one fully understands yet. And I think that's what strikes me the most. This isn't a battle born from experience. This is something entirely new, something the angels were never meant to learn. And I imagine them in that first moment, uncertain, unprepared, reacting rather than acting, because they were created for harmony, for purpose, for alignment, not for destruction, not for opposition, not for the kind of force that now begins to move between them. And I can feel the confusion in that first exchange, movements that are not yet precise, that are not yet controlled, because there is no history to guide them, no understanding of what it means to fight, only instinct, only reaction, only the sudden realization that something irreversible has begun. And I sit with that feeling for a moment, because it feels so different from the idea of war we carry. This isn't strategy, this isn't aggression built over time. This is something raw, something uncertain, something almost reluctant, because even those who chose a side, even those who stepped forward, may not have fully understood what that choice would require. And now, they are faced with it. Not as an idea, but as a reality. And I can almost see it. Angels hesitating, pulling back, unsure of how far to go, unsure of what it means to strike, unsure of what it means to stand against something that was once part of themselves. And that hesitation, that confusion, that lack of clarity is what defines this first day more than anything else. Because war, no matter where it happens, never begins with certainty. It begins with disorientation, with the collapse of what once made sense, and the sudden need to act without understanding. And I think that's why this moment feels so heavy, because nothing about it feels natural. Nothing about it feels like it belongs in a place like heaven. And yet, it is happening, slowly, painfully, inevitably. And the more it unfolds, the more the confusion begins to give way to something else. Something sharper, something more focused. Because once the first boundary is crossed, once the first act of opposition takes place, it becomes easier to continue, easier to respond, easier to justify what follows. And I find myself realizing something here, that the hardest part of conflict is not the continuation, it is the beginning. That first moment where everything shifts from possibility to reality, from thought to action, from separation to confrontation. And once that moment passes, the path forward begins to take shape, not clearly, not cleanly, but enough to carry both sides further into something they were never meant to experience. And as the first day unfolds, the chaos does not come from skill or from power. It comes from uncertainty, from the absence of understanding, from the fact that no one truly knows what they are doing. And yet, they continue, because there is no longer a way to return to what was before. And I sit with that realization for a moment longer because it changes how I see this entire conflict. This is not a war driven by mastery. It is a war born from confusion, from misalignment, from a moment where something once perfect no longer knows how to remain that way. And as I imagine the first day drawing forward, I can't help but return to a single quiet thought, one that feels simple but impossible to ignore. War, no matter where it begins, always starts with confusion, and by the time clarity arrives, it is already too late to stop what has been set in motion. And when the second day begins, it does not arrive with energy, it does not arrive with confidence, it arrives with a kind of weight, a heaviness that seems to settle over everything that remains, as if even heaven itself has felt what happened on the first day and is no longer untouched by it. And I find myself imagining that silence again. But it is not the same silence we felt before, not the peaceful stillness of harmony. This silence carries something else, something heavier, something that feels like the beginning of understanding, because the confusion of the first day, that uncertainty, that hesitation, it does not disappear, but it changes. It becomes something sharper, something clearer, something that begins to reveal what this conflict truly is. And I think that is what makes the second day so different. This is no longer about not knowing what is happening. This is the moment when they begin to understand. And that understanding is far more painful than confusion, because now the cost begins to reveal itself. Not in theory, not in possibility, but in reality, in what they can see, in what they can feel, in what they are losing. And the rebels, those who followed Lucifer, those who stepped forward believing they were choosing freedom, they begin to notice something they did not expect, something that no one had fully explained to them. They are not becoming more, they are becoming less. And I pause there, because that realization feels like the turning point, not of the war itself, but of their belief in it. Because everything they were promised, everything that felt so convincing, so aligned with their growing sense of identity, begins to shift, not all at once, not in a way that can be easily spoken, but in a way that can be felt in the weakening of their strength, in the instability of their movement, in the way their connection to the light begins to fade, slowly, quietly, but undeniably. And I imagine them standing there, still fighting, still moving forward, but carrying something else now. Doubt. Not the kind that asks questions, but the kind that answers them. And I wonder what it must feel like in that moment to realize, not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually, that something you believed in, something you committed to, is not what you thought it was. And yet, there is no way to step back, no easy path to return, because the line has already been crossed. And that's what makes this moment so heavy. Because recognition does not come with relief, it comes with consequence. And I can almost see it, the way their movements begin to change, not as coordinated, not as confident, not as certain, because now they're not only fighting the other side, they are fighting the realization forming inside themselves, and that conflict, that internal fracture, weakens them in a way that no external force could. And one by one, they begin to fall, not into nothingness, not into disappearance, but into something worse, something that feels like loss, the loss of what they once were, the loss of the light that once defined them. And I find myself holding on to that image for a moment, because it is not just defeat, it is transformation. a slow unraveling of something that cannot be restored to its original state. And I think this is when the truth becomes unavoidable, not spoken, not declared, but visible, undeniable. The rebellion is not leading them upward, it is pulling them away, not toward freedom, but toward separation. And I can't help but sit with that realization because it changes everything, not just for them, but for how we understand the entire story. This was never about gaining something greater. It was about losing connection, losing alignment, losing the very source of what made them whole. And then I wonder, as that realization settles in, how many of them feel it? How many of them see it clearly? How many of them begin to question not just the outcome, but the decision itself? And I imagine some of them hesitating, some of them pulling back, some of them looking across the divide, not with anger, but with something else, something closer to regret. And yet, even in that moment, they continue, because stopping now would mean facing everything they have already done. And that may be harder than continuing forward. And I think that's what makes this part so difficult to witness, not the loss itself, but the awareness of it, because now they are no longer blind, they are no longer uncertain. They begin to see, and seeing does not free them. It binds them even more tightly to the consequences of their choice. And as the second day unfolds, the balance begins to shift, not dramatically, not in a single decisive moment, but gradually, steadily. The rebels begin to lose ground, not just physically, but internally. And I can't help but return to a quiet thought that keeps forming in the background, one that feels simple, but heavy with meaning. Maybe, just maybe, this is the moment where they begin to realize they were never rising at all. And by the time that truth becomes clear, it may already be too late to change what they have become. And by the time the third day arrives, something has already changed in the air, not just the weight of what has been lost, but the clarity of what remains. The confusion of the first day is gone, the slow realization of the second day has settled, and now there's only one question left, not unspoken anymore, not hidden, but inevitable. How does this end? And I find myself drawn to the center of it all. Because everything begins to move toward a single point, not armies against armies, not chaos against chaos, but something more focused, more personal, two figures facing each other, and everything else seems to fall away, as if heaven itself is holding its breath. Because this is no longer just a conflict, this is a conclusion. Michael, steady, unshaken, not because he is untouched, but because he remains aligned with something beyond himself and Lucifer, still radiant, still powerful, but not the same, not whole, not complete in the way he once was. Something in him has already begun to fade, not visibly at first, not dramatically, but enough to change the way he moves, the way he holds himself, the way the light interacts with him. And I pause here because this moment feels different from everything that came before. Not louder, not more intense, but heavier, because there is no illusion left, no belief to hold on to, no narrative to justify what is happening, only truth, clear, undeniable. And I wonder what Lucifer feels in that moment, standing there, facing the one he once stood beside, not as a rival, but as a brother. And I imagine that somewhere beneath the pride, beneath the anger, beneath everything he has built within himself, there is something else, something quieter, something that recognizes what has been lost, and yet it is too late to return. Because even now, even in this final moment, he does not step back. He does not release what he has chosen. He continues, not because he believes he will win, but because he cannot accept what it would mean to surrender. And I think that realization changes everything, because this is no longer about victory, it is about refusal. Refusal to admit the truth. Refusal to let go of what has already taken root. And the battle begins, not as chaos, but as precision, as intention, as two forces meeting in a way that feels almost inevitable. Their movements are no longer uncertain, no longer hesitant. Each motion carries clarity, carries purpose. carries the weight of everything that has led to this point. And I can almost feel the difference, the contrast between them. Michael moves with steadiness, with alignment, with something that does not waver, not because he is stronger, but because he is not divided within himself. And Lucifer, he moves with intensity, with force, with everything he has left, but there is something beneath it, something that cannot be hidden anymore. Instability, not in skill, not in power, but in foundation, because the more he fights, the more it becomes clear he is no longer drawing from the same source. He is no longer sustained in the same way. And I watch that unfold slowly, quietly, the way his movements begin to strain, the way his strength begins to falter, not suddenly, not dramatically, but inevitably. And I find myself holding on to that moment. Because it is not just physical, it is something deeper, something that reflects everything that has happened within him, the separation, the disconnection, the gradual loss of what once made him whole. And I realize something here that feels almost impossible to ignore. This is not a defeat imposed from the outside. This is the result of something that has already happened within. And as the battle continues, it becomes clearer. The outcome is no longer uncertain, not because Michael overpowers him, but because Lucifer can no longer sustain what he has chosen. And then there is a moment, brief, almost silent, where everything slows, where the movement pauses, where the inevitable becomes visible, and Lucifer falls, not violently, not dramatically, but in a way that feels final. And I sit with that moment longer than I expect, because it doesn't feel like victory, it doesn't feel like triumph, there is no sense of celebration, no release, no sense that something has been gained, only the recognition that something has been lost, something that cannot be restored. And I think that is what makes this moment so difficult to understand, because from the outside, it looks like the end of a battle, but from within, it feels like the end of something far more significant, the end of what Lucifer once was, the end of a being who stood in perfect alignment, who carried light without resistance, who existed without division, and now that version of him no longer exists. And Michael stands there, not victorious, but still, because even in winning, he has lost something too, not power, not position, but a connection that can never be restored. And I find myself returning to a single quiet thought, one that stays with me longer than anything else in this story. That moment, that final moment, it was never about who won, it was about what was lost. And maybe that is what makes it so heavy, because some endings, no matter how necessary, never truly feel like victory. And after the clash fades, after the final movement settles into stillness, there is a silence that feels different from anything that came before. Not the calm silence of harmony, not the uncertain silence before conflict, but something heavier, something that carries the weight of conclusion. And I find myself lingering in that moment, because even though the battle has ended, something else is about to begin. Something that feels even more final, even more irreversible, and Lucifer lies there, no longer standing at the center of worship, no longer surrounded by admiration, no longer reflecting the same light that once defined him, and yet he is still present, still aware, still holding on to something that has not yet been taken from him, his choice. And I think that is what makes this moment so significant. Because everything that has happened so far, every thought, every shift, every decision has led here to a single moment where the outcome is not determined by power, not determined by strength, but by what he chooses to do now. And I can almost feel the stillness stretch, as if everything is waiting, not for action, but for response. And then the voice comes, not loud, not overwhelming, but unmistakable. A presence that does not need to announce itself because it is already everywhere. And I pause here because this is not a voice of anger, not a voice of force, but something deeper, something that carries both authority and sorrow. And that combination feels almost impossible to describe because it is not the voice of a conqueror. It is the voice of one who has already seen the end and still offers a way back, and I listen. Or at least try to imagine listening as the words are spoken, not as condemnation, not as immediate judgment, but as an invitation, one final moment, one final chance. Return, not as a demand, but as an opening, as if everything that has happened could still be undone, as if the distance that has formed could still be closed. And I sit with that for a moment because it changes how I see everything that came before. Because this means even now, even after the war, even after the choices that have already been made, there is still space, still possibility, still a path that leads back to what was lost. And I wonder what that must feel like to stand in that moment, to hear that voice, to know that everything could still be restored, not partially, not slowly, but completely. And yet, Lucifer does not move. He does not reach for that possibility. He does not step toward it. And I think this is the moment that feels most difficult to understand. Not the fall, not the battle, but this. Because this is where the outcome is no longer shaped by confusion, no longer shaped by influence, no longer shaped by the gradual shift of thought. This is a moment of clarity, of full awareness, of complete understanding. And still, he chooses not to return. And I find myself asking why, not out of judgment, but out of something deeper, something closer to recognition, because I've felt that resistance before, not at this scale, not with consequences this vast, but in smaller ways, quieter ways, moments where I knew I was wrong, where I saw clearly what I should do, and still hesitated, still held on to something I should have let go. And I wonder if that is what holds him here. Not ignorance, not confusion, but something else, something that feels heavier, pride, not the kind that elevates, but the kind that refuses, the kind that cannot accept stepping back, cannot accept undoing what has already been done. And I realize something in that moment that feels almost impossible to ignore. Sometimes the hardest thing is not choosing the right path. It is admitting that the path we chose was wrong, and Lucifer, even now, cannot do that. And so the silence breaks, not with movement, but with refusal, a quiet, final refusal. And I feel settled because this is the moment where everything becomes irreversible, not because there is no other option, but because the option that remains is no longer chosen. And I sit with that realization for a moment longer, because it changes how I understand this entire story. The fall was not sealed in the battle, it was sealed here, in the refusal to return, in the moment where restoration was still possible and still rejected. And I can't help but feel the finality of that, because once this moment passes, there is no more hesitation, no more waiting, no more possibility of reversal, only consequence, only separation, only the unfolding of what has already been decided. And I find myself holding on to a single quiet thought, one that feels heavier the longer it stays. This was the moment, the last moment, where everything could have been different, and once it passed, there was no turning back. And once that final refusal settles into place, once the last opportunity to return is left behind, something begins to change. Not gradually this time, not in the slow, almost invisible way we have seen before, but with a clarity that cannot be mistaken, because now there's nothing left to hold it back. The separation that began as a thought, that grew into belief, that turned into action, now becomes reality. And I find myself watching this moment with a kind of stillness, because this is no longer about choice. This is consequence. And Lucifer, the one who once carried light as if it were part of his very being, begins to lose it, not all at once, not in a single instant, but in a way that feels irreversible, as if the source that once flowed through him has been cut off, not taken away, but disconnected. And I try to imagine what that must feel like. Not pain, not in the way we understand it, but something deeper, something closer to absence, like some essential is no longer there. And the more I think about it, the more unsettling it becomes, because light was not something external to him. It was something that defined him, something that gave shape to who he was, and now that identity begins to unravel, slowly, steadily. The brilliance that once surrounded him begins to fade. The reflections that once moved effortlessly across his form begin to dim. And I pause here, because this is not just a visual change. This is something far more profound. This is the loss of alignment, the loss of connection, the loss of what made him whole. And I realize something in that moment that feels impossible to ignore. He is not becoming something new. He is becoming less. Less than what he was created to be, less than what he once embodied. And that reduction, that unraveling, is what defines this transformation. And then the movement begins, not upward, not outward, but downward. And I find myself holding on to that direction because it feels symbolic, not just physical, but reflective of everything that has happened within him. Because the rise he imagined, the ascent he declared, never truly existed. It was always a movement away, not toward. And now that direction reveals itself fully as he is cast down, not pushed violently, not thrown in chaos, but removed, separated, placed outside of the presence he once stood within. And I imagine that descent not as a sudden fall, but as something that stretches, something that feels endless, as if the distance between what he was and what he is becoming continues to expand with every moment. And I can't help but sit with that image because it carries something deeper than motion. It carries meaning, because no one falls faster, no one falls further than someone who once stood at the highest point. And I feel the weight of that truth settle in, because it changes how I see the entire story. This was never just about rebellion. It was about contrast, about the distance between what is possible and what is lost. And Lucifer, now no longer the light bearer, no longer the morning star, becomes something else, not suddenly, but inevitably, something defined not by what he holds, but by what he has lost. And I think about that name, Satan, and how different it feels. Not radiant, not inspiring, not beautiful in the way it once was, but heavy, sharp, defined by opposition. And I wonder what it means to become that, to shift from alignment to resistance, from harmony to conflict. And I realized something here that feels both simple and profound. This was not a transformation into power. It was a transformation into separation, into distance, into something that no longer reflects the source it came from. And as I sit with that realization, I can't help but feel the weight of it on a more personal level, because this is not just a story about a fallen heaven. It is a reflection of something that exists much closer to us, because the pattern is the same, the movement is the same, not sudden, not dramatic, but gradual, until one moment it becomes visible. And I return to that thought again, quietly, almost reluctantly. No one falls faster than the one who once stood the highest. And maybe that's why this part of the story feels so heavy, because it reminds us that the greater the height, the greater the distance, when everything begins to slip away. And after the fall, after the light has receded from what once carried it so fully, there is a silence that lingers, not empty, not peaceful in the way it once was, but altered, as if something within the very fabric of heaven has shifted. And I find myself staying in that moment longer than I expected, because this is not the kind of ending that restores what was lost. It is the kind that leaves something behind, something that cannot be undone, because even though the rebellion has been stopped, even though the line has been redrawn, heaven is no longer the same place it once was. And I think that is what feels most difficult to accept. Not the fall itself, but the fact that its effects remain. Because before all of this, everything existed in perfect alignment. Nothing hidden, nothing fractured, nothing held back. But now, there is memory, there is awareness, there is the undeniable knowledge that something once whole has been broken. And even though the light still fills that realm, even though the order is restored, there is a difference, subtle but undeniable, as if something has passed through it, leaving a trace that cannot be erased. And I imagine the angels who remain, those who did not turn away, those who stayed aligned with the source they were created from. And I wonder what it must feel like for them now, to stand again in the presence of that same light, to continue in the same purpose, and yet carry the memory of what has happened, the absence of those who once stood beside them, the silence where voices once joined in harmony. And I realize something here that feels almost impossible to ignore. Even in victory, there is loss. Even in restoration, there is change. Because something has been revealed that cannot be unseen, that harmony can be disrupted, that alignment can be broken, that even the highest can fall, and that awareness changes everything. And then there is something else, something that did not exist before, something that now moves beyond heaven itself, because what has fallen does not disappear. It transforms, it continues, but in a different form, in a different direction. And I think about that for a moment, because the rebellion did not end with the fall. It did not dissolve into nothingness. It became something else, something that exists outside the light, something that no longer reflects it. And that is where the idea of the adversary takes shape, not just as a figure, but as a force, something that stands in opposition, not because it was created that way, but because it chose to become that. And I pause here, because this is where the story expands beyond heaven. This is where it begins to move into something closer to us. Because if the conflict remained contained, if it ended completely in that moment, it would remain distant, abstract, something we could observe without feeling connected to. But it doesn't. It continues, not in the same form, not in the same place, but in a way that feels more subtle, more present, more immediate, because the adversary does not simply exist. It acts, it influences, it continues to carry the same patterns that began with a single thought. And I find myself reflecting on that, because the origin of it all was not destruction. It was misalignment. It was the quiet shift away from something greater. And that pattern does not remain confined to one place. It repeats, it echoes, it finds new spaces to exist. And that realization feels heavier the more I sit with it, because it means the story is not over, not truly. It has only changed its form, changed its location, changed the way it appears. And I return to that thought again, slowly, almost reluctantly. The war did not end, it moved. It moved from heaven into something closer, something more personal, something that exists not in distant realms, but in the choices that continue to unfold. And I realize something here that feels both simple and deeply unsettling. The same forces that shaped that fall, the same patterns that led to that separation, still exist, not as distant events, but as possibilities. Possibilities that can take shape wherever thought is allowed to move without alignment. And I sit with that realization for a moment longer, because it changes how I see everything that has happened. This was never just a story about a war in heaven. It was the beginning of something that continues, something that echoes through time, through choices, through moments that seem small until they are not. And as that thought settles, I can't help but hold on to one quiet truth. The conflict never truly ended. It simply found a new place to exist. And this is the part where I can't stay distant anymore, where the story stops feeling like something that happened far away in a place beyond us and begins to feel uncomfortably close. Because if everything we've seen so far remained only in heaven, only among angels, only in a realm untouched by human experience, it would be easier to observe, easier to reflect, easier to separate ourselves from it, but it doesn't stay there. It never did. It moves, it continues, it finds its way into something far more familiar, far more immediate. And I find myself asking a question that feels different from all the others. Not about Lucifer, not about heaven, but about us. Because if the pattern began with a thought, if it grew through awareness, if it spread through comparison, if it solidified through belief, and if it led to separation, then what stops that same pattern from unfolding again? not in a place of light beyond our reach, but here, in the quiet spaces of our own lives. And I sit with that for a moment because it changes everything. It changes how I see the entire story. This is no longer just about a being who fell. It becomes a mirror, something that reflects something deeper, something that exists within all of us, because the same thoughts, the same subtle shifts, the same moments of awareness, they are not unique to Lucifer. They are part of what it means to think, to observe, to become aware of oneself. And I realized something here that feels almost impossible to ignore. The war did not move to Earth in the way we might imagine, not as armies, not as visible conflict, but as something quieter, something internal, something that plays out in decisions, in thoughts, in moments where we choose how we see ourselves and how we see everything around us. And I think about pride, not the obvious kind, not arrogance that announces itself loudly, but the quieter form, the one that begins as recognition, as awareness, as a simple acknowledgement of something good, and then slowly, almost invisibly, becomes something else, something that centers everything around itself, something that shifts focus away from alignment and toward identity. And I can't help but recognize that pattern because I've seen it, not in grand moments, not in dramatic choices, but in small ways. Moments where appreciation becomes expectation, where success becomes ownership, where something that was once received begins to feel like something that belongs entirely to us. And I pause here, because this is where the story becomes difficult, not because it is complex, but because it is familiar, because it asks something of us, not just to listen, but to reflect, to notice, to question what we carry, what we repeat, what we allow to stay without challenge. And I realize something that feels both simple and deeply unsettling. The same process that led to that fall still exists, not in a distant realm, but in the quiet decisions we make every day, the thoughts we return to, the comparisons we allow to grow, the questions we ask without grounding them in something greater than ourselves. And I think about how easy it is, how natural it feels, how unremarkable it seems in the moment, because nothing about it feels like the beginning of something destructive. It feels like clarity, like understanding, like stepping into something more. And yet, that is exactly where it begins, and I find myself returning to one thought again and again, not as a conclusion, but as a quiet realization that refuses to leave. Maybe this story was never meant to be distant. Maybe it was never meant to remain in heaven. Maybe it was always meant to move, to echo, to repeat, not in the same form, not with the same scale, but with the same pattern, the same choices, the same consequences. And I sit with that idea for a moment longer because it changes how I see everything that has come before. This was never just about Lucifer. It was never just about angels. It was never just about a war that lasted 3 days. It is something ongoing, something that continues in ways we don't always notice, in moments that seem small until they aren't. And I can't help but ask myself one final question, one that feels quieter than all the others, but heavier in its meaning. If the same seeds exist within us, the same awareness, the same capacity to shift, the same tendency to hold on to thoughts that feel true, then where does that leave us? And what do we do with it? And as I sit with that question, letting it remain unanswered, letting it settle instead of resolving it too quickly, I realize something that feels both simple and profound. Maybe, just maybe, this story was never really about Lucifer at all. Maybe it has always been about us,